Recording by Kate Follis. Love Romances of the Aristocracy by Thornton Hall. Chapter 4. The Stain on the Shirley Scutcheon. The Shirleys have been men of high honour and fair repute ever since the faraway days when the Conqueror found their ancestor, Suillus, firmly seated on his broad Warwickshire lands at Edington. But their proud scutcheon, otherwise unsullied, bears one black, or rather red, stain, and it was Lawrence Shirley, 4th Earl of his line, who put it there. Horace Walpole calls this degenerate Shirley a low wretch, a mad assassin, and a wild beast. He was, as my story will show, all this. He was indeed an incarnate fiend. But was he to blame? He was possessed by devils, but they were devils of insanity. The taint of madness was in his blood before he uttered his first cry in the cradle. His uncle, whose coronet he was to wear, was an incurable madman. His aunt, the Lady Barbara Shirley, spent years of her life shut up in an asylum, and this hereditary taint shadowed Lawrence Shirley's life from his infancy and ended it in tragedy. As a boy, he was subject to violent attacks of rage when it was not safe to approach him, and his madness grew with his years. Strange tales are told of him as a young man. We are told that he would spend hours pacing like a wild animal, up and down his room, gnashing his teeth, clenching his fists, grinning diabolically, and uttering strange, incoherent cries. He would stand before a mirror, making horrible grimaces at his reflection and spitting upon it. He walked about armed with pistols and dagger, ready at a moment to use both on anyone who annoyed or opposed him, and in his disordered brain he nursed suspicion and hatred of all around him. When he was little more than 30, and some years after he had come into his earldom, he wooed and won the pretty daughter of Sir William Meredith, but before the honeymoon was ended, he had begun to treat her with such gross brutality that before she had long been a wife, she petitioned Parliament for a divorce, which set her free. And as he was obviously quite unfit to administer his estates, it became necessary to appoint someone to receive his rents and control his revenue. Such was the pitiful plight to which insanity had reduced Lawrence, Earl Ferrers, while still little over the threshold of manhood. And these calamities only, and perhaps naturally, accentuated his madness. He became more and more the terror of the neighbourhood in which he lived, and few had the courage to meet him when he took his solitary walks. "I still retain," writes a Mr. Craddock in his memoirs, "a strong impression of the unfortunate Earl Ferrers, who, with the Ladies Shirley, his sisters, frequented Leicester races, and visited at my father's house. During the early part of the day, his lordship preserved the character of a polite scholar and a courteous nobleman, but in the evening he became the terror of the inhabitants, and I distinctly remember running upstairs to hide myself when an alarm was given that Lord Ferrers was coming armed, with a great mob after him. He had behaved well at the ordinary. The races were then in the afternoon, and the ladies regularly attended the balls. My father's house was situated midway between Lord Ferrers' lodging and the town hall, where the race assemblies were then held. He had, as was supposed, obtained liquor privately, and then became outrageous, for from our house he suddenly escaped, and proceeded to the town hall, and after many violent acts, threw a silver tankard of scalding negus among the ladies. He was then secured for that evening. This was the last time of his appearing at Leicester, till brought from Ashby de la Zouch to prison there. It has been much regretted by his friends that, as Lady Ferrers and some of his property had been taken from him, no greater precaution had been used with respect to his own safety, as well as that of all around him. Whilst sober, my father, who had a real regard for him, always urged that he was quite manageable, and when his sisters ventured to come with him to the races, they had an absolute reliance on his good intentions and promises. Once He disappeared for a time and made his way to London, where he lodged obscurely in the neighbourhood of Muswell Hill. Here he surrounded himself with grooms and ostlers and other low company of both sexes, abandoning himself to orgies of debauchery. Among his milder eccentricities he would, we are told, mix mud with his beer, and drain tankard after tankard of the nauseating mixture. He drank his coffee from the spout of the coffee-pot, and wandered about a grotesque figure with one side of his face clean-shaven. But even then he had sane moments, when the raving madman of yesterday became the courteous, polite, shrewd man of today, charming all by his wit and high-bred geniality. It was, of course, inevitable that a career such as this, marked by a madness which grew daily, should lead sooner or later to tragedy. And tragedy was coming swiftly. It came early in the year 1760, before Lord Ferrers had reached his 40th birthday, and this is how it came. The Court of Chancery had ordered that his lordship's rent should be received and accounted for by a receiver, who by way of concession to his feelings was to be appointed by himself. The Earl, who rarely lacked shrewdness, looked round for the most suitable person to fill this delicate post, for a man who should be as clay in his hands, and such a tool he thought he had found in his steward, Mr. John Johnson, who had known him since boyhood, and who had never thwarted him even in his maddest caprices. Mr. Johnson was duly appointed receiver, but the Earl's self-congratulation was short-lived. The steward proved that he was possessed of a conscience, and that neither cajolery nor threats could make him swerve from the straight path of honesty. In vain the Earl coaxed and blustered and bullied. The receiver was adamant. He had a duty to perform, and at any cost he would discharge it. His lordship's rage at such unlooked-for recalcitrancy was unbounded. He began to hate the too honest steward with a murderous hatred. Behind his back he loaded him with abuse, and vowed that, of all his enemies, the steward was the most virulent and implacable. But while the Earl was nursing this diabolical hatred, he showed little sign of it to Johnson, who was so unsuspectingly walking to meet tragedy. One January day in 1760, Lord Ferrers sent a polite message to his steward to come to Staunton Herald on an urgent matter of business. It was on a Friday, and punctually at 2 o'clock, the hour appointed, Mr. Johnson made his appearance, and was ushered into his lordship's study. Unknown to him, Lord Ferrers had sent away his housekeeper and his men-servants on various pretexts, and apart from the Earl and the steward, the spider and the fly, there was no one in all the great house but 3 maidservants, whose chief anxiety was to keep as far away as possible from their mad master. With a courteous greeting, Lord Ferrers invited Mr. Johnson to take a seat, and then, placing before him a document, which proved to be a confession of fraud and dishonesty in his office of receiver, he commanded his steward to sign his name to it. On reading the confession which he was ordered to sign, Mr. Johnson indignantly refused to comply with such an outrageous demand. "You refuse to sign?" asked the Earl with ominous calmness. "I do," was the emphatic reply. "Then," continued his lordship, producing a pistol, "I command you to kneel." Mr. Johnson, now alarmed and awake to his danger, looked first at the stern cold eyes bent on him, and then at the pistol pointed at his heart, and sank on one knee. "Both knees," insisted the Earl. Mr. Johnson subsided on the other knee, looking calmly at his would-be murderer, though beads of perspiration were standing on his forehead. A moment later a shot rang out in the silent room, and the steward fell to the floor mortally wounded. Laying down the smoking weapon, Lord Ferrers opened the door and called loudly for assistance. The horrified servants, who had heard the report, came, huddled and fearful at his bidding. One he dispatched for a doctor, and with the assistance of the other 2, he carried the fast-dying man to a bedroom. When the doctor arrived, he found the Earl standing by the bedside, trying to stop the flow of blood which was ebbing from the steward's chest, but the victim was beyond all human aid. He had but a few hours at the most to live. An hour later, Lord Ferrers was lying dead drunk on the floor of his bedroom, while Mr. Johnson's life was ebbing out in agony at his house a mile away. As soon as it became known, to quote the account given by an eyewitness in the Gentleman's Magazine, that Mr. Johnson was really dead, the neighbours set about seizing the murderer. A few persons, armed, set out for Staunton, and as they entered the hall yard they saw the Earl going towards the stable, as they imagined, to take horse. He appeared to be just out of bed, his stockings being down and his garters in his hand, having probably taken the alarm immediately on coming out of his room, and finding that Johnson had been removed. One Springthorpe, advancing toward his lordship, presented a pistol, and required him to surrender. But his lordship, putting his hand to his pocket, Springthorpe imagined he was feeling for a pistol, and stopped short, being probably intimidated. He thus suffered the Earl to escape back into the house, where he fastened the doors and stood on his defence. The crowd of people who had come to apprehend him beset the house, and their number increased very fast. In about 2 hours Lord Ferrers appeared at the garret window and called out, "How is Johnson?" Springthorpe answered, "He's dead," upon which his lordship insulted him and called him a liar, and swore he would not believe anybody but the surgeon, Kirkland. Upon being again assured that he was dead, he desired that the people might be dispersed, saying that he would surrender, yet almost in the same breath he desired that the people might be let in and have some victuals and drink. But the issue was that he went away again from the window, swearing that he would not be taken. The people, however, still continued near the house, and 2 hours later he was seen on the Bowling Green by one Curtis, a collier. My lord was then armed with a blunderbuss and dagger and 2 or 3 pistols, but Curtis, so far from being intimidated, marched boldly up to him, and his lordship was so struck with the determinate resolution shown by this brave fellow that he suffered him to seize him without making any resistance. Yet the moment that he was in custody, he declared that he had killed a villain, and that he gloried in the deed. The tragedy is now hastening to its close. The assassin was kept in custody at Ashby until a coroner's jury brought in a verdict of wilful murder against him, when he was transferred to Leicester, and a fortnight later to London, making the journey in his own splendid equipage with 6 horses, and dressed like a jockey in a close riding frock, jockey boots and cap, and a plain shirt. He was lodged in the Round Tower of the Tower of London, where, with a couple of warders at his elbow night and day, with sentries posted outside his door and another on the drawbridge, he passed away the last weeks of his doomed life. In mid-April he was duly tried by his peers at the bar of the House of Lords, and although he tried with marvellous skill and ingenuity to prove that he was insane when he committed the murder, he was, without a dissentient voice, pronounced guilty, and sentenced to be hanged by the neck until he was dead, when his body should be handed over to the surgeons for dissection. One concession he claimed, pitiful salve to his pride, that he should be hanged by a cord of silk, the privilege due to his rank as a peer of the realm, and this was granted as a matter of course. One day in early May the scaffold was reared at Tyburn, where so many other malefactors had looked their last on the world, and at 9 o'clock in the morning Lord Ferrers started on his last journey, the most splendid and most tragic of his checkered life. He was allowed, as a last favour, to travel to his death, not in the common hangman's cart as an ordinary criminal, but in his own landau, driven by 6 beautiful horses, and thus he made his stately progress to Tyburn. Probably no man ever journeyed to the scaffold under such circumstances of pomp and splendour. It might well, indeed, have been the bridal procession of a great nobleman that the black avenues of curious spectators in London streets had come to see, and not the last grim journey of a malefactor to the hangman's rope. His very dress was that of a bridegroom, consisting, as it did, to quote again from the Gentleman's Magazine, of a suit of light-coloured clothes embroidered with silver, said to have been his wedding suit, and soon after the sheriff entered the landau he said, "You may, perhaps, sir, think it strange to see me in this dress, but I have my particular reasons for it." The procession then began in the following order. A very large body of constables of the county of Middlesex, preceded by one of the high constables, a party of horse grenadiers, and a party of foot. Mr. Sheriff Errington in his chariot, accompanied by his under-sheriff, Mr. Jackson, the landau escorted by 2 other parties of horse grenadiers and foot. Mr. Sheriff Valent's chariot, in which was Under-Sheriff Mr. Nichols, a mourning coach and 6, with some of his lordship's friends, and lastly a hearse and 6, provided for the conveyance of his lordship's corpse from the place of execution to Surgeons' Hall. The procession moved so slowly that Lord Ferrers was 2 hours and 3/4 in his landau, but during the whole time he appeared perfectly easy and composed, though he often expressed his desire to have it over, saying that the apparatus of death and the passing through such crowds of people was 10 times worse than death itself. He told the sheriff that he had written to the king begging that he might suffer where his ancestor, the Earl of Essex, had suffered, namely on Tower Hill, that he had been in the greater hope of obtaining this favour as he had the honour of quartering part of the same arms and of being allied to his majesty, and that he thought it hard that he should have to die at the place appointed for the execution of common felons. As to his crime, he declared that he did it under particular circumstances, having met with so many crosses and vexations that he scarcely knew what he did. At the top of Drury Lane he paused to drink his last glass of wine, handing a guinea to the man who presented it. On the scaffold not a muscle moved as he surveyed the black crowd of onlookers with a calm and amused eye. To the chaplain he confessed his belief in God, and he exchanged a few pleasant words with the executioner as he placed a gold coin in his hand. Thus, cold, calm, without rancour or regret, perished Lawrence, Earl Ferrers, not even a struggle marking the moment when life left him. After hanging for an hour, his body was taken down and removed to Surgeons' Hall, where it was dissected, and thus mutilated, it was exposed to public derision and malediction before it found a final resting place 14 feet deep under the belfry of old St. Pancras Church. Such is the stain which burns red on the Shirley shield, and such was the man who placed it there. But as we have seen, Lawrence Shirley was mad beyond all doubt, and knew not what he did, and in the eyes of all charitable and right-thinking men, the scutcheon of the Ferrers earldom remains as virtually unsullied today as when it was virginally fresh 2 centuries ago. End of chapter 4.